Whether it's riding trains, riding your bike, a trip to the beach, exploring a terrifying new location, or just wandering through the city at night, the DJI Osmo Pocket is the perfect camera to capture your travels. But let's be honest, many of us aren't vloggers or filmmakers. We're just capturing memories. And all too often, we shoot a bunch of random clips, dump them onto a hard drive, never to touch them again. That's why lately I've been getting into the cinematic travel montage. Because while a folder full of random clips is easy to ignore, a 2-minute video with some music, rhythm, and a bit of intention, that's something I might actually come back to. So, if you want to create something like that on your next trip without letting the filming take over your whole vacation, here's the basic blueprint. First, we'll start before you leave with the Osmo Pocket settings I dial in before even leaving the house. Then I'll share 4 real-world shooting tips for when you're actually on the road, like what kinds of shots to focus on and how long to hold them, because travel filming isn't like a planned and controlled shoot. You have to work with the places, light, and spontaneous moments the trip gives you. Finally, I'll cover the edit and the grade for when you're back home, which lets you take even the most ordinary footage of, say, a building or a road and turn them into something more interesting. So let's start with the quick pre-flight checklist. These are 3 essential settings worth getting right before you even leave the house. Dial these in, ideally saving them as a custom profile, and you'll ensure all your travel footage has that classic cinematic foundation. The first one is frame rate. For my last trip, I shot in 24 FPS on the Osmo Pocket 4, which is what I'd recommend if you're going for the traditional cinematic look. It's the frame rate of film and gives you that familiar cadence you're used to seeing on the big screen. The trade-off is that 24 FPS is less forgiving than 30 FPS. Hands and other movements can look juddery if you're not careful, so you need to be a bit more intentional with how you move the camera. So if you want something a bit easier and smoother, there's nothing wrong with shooting in 30 FPS instead, which is actually what I was usually shooting in on my Osmo Pocket 3. But recently, for travel footage, I'm finding myself more into the 24 FPS look. Of course, there is one exception to all this, which is that if you want slow motion sequences, you'll need to treat those clips differently and shoot them at a higher frame rate, like 60 FPS, and slow them down in post. The second setting is shutter speed, because if there's one thing that separates cinematic footage from regular footage, it might just be motion blur. That natural blur is what helps motion feel smooth and organic instead of sharp and choppy. And motion blur becomes even more important when shooting in 24 FPS because without it, movement can feel especially harsh and staccato-like. To get natural looking motion blur, you should follow the 180-degree shutter rule. That means manually setting your shutter speed to roughly double your frame rate, so 1/50 for 24 FPS or 1/60 for 30 FPS. The only problem is that during the day, these slower shutter speeds let in too much light. So if you want to keep that natural motion blur outdoors, you'll need ND filters, which basically act like sunglasses for your camera. And the third and last setting is your camera's log color profile. On the Pocket 3, that means D-Log M, and on the Pocket 4, that means D-Log. While the normal color profile is great for regular footage and is what I use for things like product shots and demonstrations on this channel, for a travel montage, you'll want to shoot in log for the extra grading flexibility. I'd also turn down the texture on the Pocket 4 or sharpness on the Pocket 3. These small cameras can look a little too crisp and digital by default, so reducing that setting helps take the edge off and gives the footage a softer, less processed feel. That's the basic setup I lock in before the trip: frame rate for the cinematic feel, shutter speed for natural motion blur, and log for flexibility in the grade. But settings are only the starting point. Once you're actually traveling, the bigger challenge is using the camera in a way that fits the trip without slowing everything down or coming home with footage that's difficult to use in the edit. So my first tip is to think in terms of depth, not breadth. One of the biggest traps when filming while traveling is treating the video the same way we might treat photos. You arrive somewhere, grab one quick shot of the main landmark, and then move on to the next. That might work for a photo album, but for a video montage, it can leave you with a random collection of disconnected clips. So instead of getting one shot at 10 different locations, it can often be more productive to get 5 or 6 shots at one location. Perhaps a wide shot to set the scene, something more personal, and a few other angles that can help flesh out the moment. And that's what makes the final video feel less like a slideshow of places you visited and more like a memory you can step back into. The next tip is to make still shots your bread and butter. When you've got a gimbal camera like the Osmo Pocket, it's really tempting to constantly move around while recording, or even try and pull off some cool gimbal moves. But for a cinematic travel montage, that kind of footage can be surprisingly hard to use. The more dynamic a shot is, the more specific it becomes, and unless you've planned a full sequence in advance, it can be difficult to drop that shot into an edit without it feeling random or completely out of place. So for most travel shooting, I think simple, static shots of around 10 to 20 seconds are a good foundation. From there, you can mix in a few other types of shots. A pan to follow the action, a slow tilt to reveal something, or a walking shot can all work when the scene calls for it. And of course, there's the classic transit shot, filming from a train, car, boat, or cable car, where the camera stays steady but the world moves through the frame. Those are some of my favorite shots for travel montages. So the basic idea is don't move the camera just because you can, move it when the shot actually needs it. Another thing that surprised me after my last trip was just how much I ended up relying on clips I'd shot with the 2x zoom on the Pocket 4 rather than the regular 1x view. When you're traveling, you don't always have the luxury of stopping, moving closer, or getting the perfect angle. Sometimes you're trying to keep up with the group, avoid holding everyone back, and still get the shot before the moment disappears. That's where zoom becomes really useful. It lets you isolate the subject, cut out distractions, and simplify the composition, which can make a huge difference when you're filming on the go. Now on the Osmo Pocket 3 and 4, the 2x zoom is a sensor crop, so you do lose some quality and sharpness compared to shooting at 1x. But for a personal travel montage, I'd argue that better framing is usually way more important than perfect image quality. Now unfortunately, on the Pocket 3 there's a bigger issue here. You can't zoom in while recording, and you can't use it in D-Log-M. So if you're on the Pocket 3, you'll have to do things the old-fashioned way and get physically closer if you can. And finally, more of a Pocket 4 specific tip, for ND filters, I'd recommend using a variable ND filter instead of fixed ones. As I mentioned earlier, a key ingredient for cinematic footage is motion blur, which means using ND filters in right conditions. But on the Pocket 4, D-Log has a much narrower ISO range than D-Log-M on the Pocket 3, so the camera has less room to compensate when the light changes. And I felt that immediately on my last trip. With fixed ND filters on the Pocket 4, I kept having to stop and swap filters whenever the light changed, just to maintain that slower shutter speed without over or underexposing. And when you're traveling, that's exactly the kind of thing you don't want to be doing. So I ended up mostly relying on my ND32 to 512 variable ND instead. Now VNDs aren't without their own trade-offs. They're prone to color shifts and polarization artifacts, but for travel shooting, the convenience was definitely worth it for me. Instead of constantly stopping to change filters, I could just rotate the filter, adjust strength, and keep shooting. So finally, let's talk about the editing and grading process, where you take all those small clips you've gathered from your trip and condense them into a short, finished montage. I'm still figuring this out myself, but this is the basic workflow I used for my last trip. The first thing I do is shortlist the clips I might actually want to use, either because they look visually pleasing or because they remind me of a specific moment from the trip. Once I have that rough selection, that's when I choose the music. And this is probably the most important part of the whole edit, especially if, like me, you mostly shoot atmosphere and vibe shots rather than scenes where something is actually happening. In these kinds of montages, the music does a lot of the heavy lifting. For example, take this sequence with no music. and then watch it again with music. The shot hasn't changed, but the feeling completely changes. For my montage, I used Epidemic Sounds because I'm uploading to YouTube and need properly licensed music. But if you're just making something for yourself, then you can basically use whatever track fits the memory and mood you want to create. Now the music will give you a basic structure for your montage, so the edit just becomes a case of fitting clips into that flow, while building around a few key shots you really want to include. So in my case, I used the calmer, more peaceful shots from the trip near the beginning because that matched the quieter part of the track. Then, as the music built up towards the end, I used busier city scenes to match that increased energy. Once the core sequence is built, then you can start refining things on a smaller level. Sometimes that means cutting directly on the beat. Sometimes it means cutting slightly before or after the beat so the edit feels less mechanical. And sometimes it means letting a shot breathe for a little longer. There isn't really a formula here, you just have to play it back and feel whether the rhythm works. Then for transitions, I kept things simple. Mostly straight cuts, with the occasional cross dissolve when I wanted to suggest time or distance passing. Now let's talk about the grade, where you give the footage its finishing touch, shape the overall mood, and make the montage feel more cohesive. The simplest option is honestly just to apply DJI's official LUT and leave it at that. So if you're shooting on the Pocket 3, that would be the D-Log M LUT, and if you're shooting on the Pocket 4, that would be the D-Log to Rec 709 LUT, or the Vivid version of it. And to be honest, this approach, plus some basic tweaks to exposure, contrast, and white balance if necessary, will look very good most of the time. But once you move beyond the official LUT, the grade becomes a lot more personal. I don't think there's one exact recipe I can give you here, and experimenting with the look is actually one of the most fun parts of working with travel footage. Personally, I own DaVinci Resolve Studio, so I'll often use the Film Look Creator to give it a more filmic look, add a bit of halation, experiment with split tones, and add things like vignetting or film grain. And yes, it's very easy to overdo this stuff. Sometimes you can spend half an hour tweaking the image only to realize you've made it worse. But it can give your montage a bit more character than the cleaner, more clinical out-of-camera look, and it's all part of the fun. And that's really the bigger point of all this. The goal isn't to turn every trip into a serious filmmaking project or to spend the whole vacation stressing about every shot. It's just to be a little more intentional. Dial in some basic settings before you leave, stick with basic shots before getting experimental, and then use music, rhythm, and a bit of grading to turn everything into something you might watch again. I had a ton of fun putting this first montage together, so I'm going to keep challenging myself to make them on future trips as well. So if you're used to shooting lots of clips, but not actually turning them into anything, maybe this is a good time to start.